All right, everyone, welcome back to Deep Dive, right? We had to reboot this a little bit so that it sounds more professional. Thank you so much for everyone joining us. Today, we have another special guest. All of our guests are special, but this one is very interesting because, of course, Hunter Marston is someone I've been working with throughout the years. And the first piece that actually we did together, the first work was about the impact of Trump administration in Asia and how Asia has to deal with the Trump administration. Obviously, in a previous episode, among others, we had conversation, for instance, with Elbridge Colby, who, maybe will end up in some senior position should Trump win there. But I wanted to get a kind of a scholarly academic point, someone who's not in the running necessarily for a top position in under Trump, unless please correct me otherwise. So I want to talk to Hunter Marston, who was, of course, a very good friend of ours from the Brookings day. More recently, of course, he has been based in Australia and probably is going to go back to the US after doing a fantastic job back in Australia. Now, one thing I appreciate with Hunter is that a lot of his work is on the Southeast Asian region. So he's not your typical American, like looking at the world and you tiny countries, you're just the grass that we with the elephant of China are gonna trample upon. No, he very much a sympathetic point of view, similar to Greg Pauling and some of the other fantastic guests we had on this podcast. Okay, after that very long introduction, thank you, Hunter Marston. Thank you, Hunter, for joining us.
Thank you, my good friend Richard. It's great to see you here. I'm humbled by your introduction, and the comparison to Greg Polling is quite flattering. And I know you weren't comparing me to Bridge Colby, but I am far from under consideration for any senior Trump administration positions in a number of ways.
Well, you never know, right? I was just in Stanford the other week, and a couple of ex-Trump admin folks are now working in Stanford, right? It looks like I'm not saying that he has to scrape the bottom at some point, if ever, because
Mm,
like everyone is keeping away. But you never know, Hunter. I mean, we have a kind of a half sarcastic expression in the Philippines. We say para sa bayan. Para is Spanish, like for sabayan means for the country, right? Like let's just close our eyes and hold our
right.
nose and let's go. Maybe some you never know, Hunter. So never say never. But nevertheless, I think that will be a good starting point, Hunter. Before we go into your fantastic research, your dissertation, congratulations. We're already in the final phases so that we can add the Latin title to you soon. Um,
Nearly.
of course, really good works. I recommend it to my own students. I think you're really at the cutting edge here, and without ruffling feathers. That's something that's quite an accomplishment. Usually, when young scholars are doing something good, you're gonna ruffle some feathers. So keep it up. Now, before we go to Southeast Asia and hedging, because I think a lot of our audience would be interested in about what do you think about how can Southeast Asian countries play the superpowers against each other? I mean, is there room for maneuver and all of that kind of discourse? But before we go there, can you tell me about the state of discourse and state of mind, I would say, rather, in America, especially among our circles, the kind of a wonky circles, vis-a-vis the upcoming elections? Because the latest polls that are coming out are really, really troubling when it comes to battleground states for Biden. And I had talks from South Carolina to Berkeley, Stanford. So I've been in and out of the US for the past month. And so I hardly saw a single person excited about Biden 2.0.
Mm.
It's not about being a fan of Trump. It's more about not being excited about Biden. And I think that troubles me because the asymmetric demobilization usually doesn't benefit the better guys, if I can put it that way, or at least the left or Democrats, as we saw in other countries. So that's a long. Sorry, this is a conversation, so I hope people accept my apology for putting a lot of interjections here. What's up, man? Like, what's going on?
Yeah, well, you mentioned my return to America. I moved back from Canberra, Australia, where I was completing my PhD to the state of Rhode Island, our smallest state in the United States. And it's an interesting one. It's very blue, typically blue being affiliated with the Democratic voters, Democratic Party, that is, not Democratic small d. But even here, you drive out of a city, and we have a lot of farms here, and there are Trump flags. There's a lot of animosity against Biden, and I think in some ways that taps into the sort of zeitgeist in America now. We remain very polarized. If you watch Fox News, for instance, it's constantly talking about the southern border and Biden's failure to rein in inflation. And these issues matter to American voters, right? We could talk about the war in Gaza and the war in Ukraine. A lot of the Republican Party's platform now is very distant from where it has been traditionally, right? Strong defense, a bulwark against Russian aggression, etc. And the state of America right now, I see things as having rebounded a significant deal from the COVID period, right? Inflation is down, job growth is up, unemployment is down, and yet that perception has not sunk in among Americans. So ordinary Americans tend to still feel pessimistic about the state of our country, which is never good for an incumbent. Now, another interesting poll you've probably seen is something like 80% of voters would rather see would rather not see one or both candidates, Trump and Biden, in this election. So there's just a general um, on there's a general unhappiness with the election that's being presented. The choice is not an attractive one, right? The
Hunter, sorry to
polls,
cut you there, but how is this
yeah,
different from 2016? Because immediately everyone was like, wow, I heard the same thing in 2016.
right.
What is different this time that makes you really, really more troubled? Because in 2016, I think not many
Mm.
were sold on a Trump winning, but this time it looks like more people are sold on a Trump winning. So
Mm.
what is the level of grievance now that really worries you even more than 2016?
Yeah, I'm actually coming around to this point that I'm not I'm more worried than I was in 2016 because I was caught unawares in 2016. But at the same time, polls that express a favorable view of Trump and dispositive or disfavorable views of Biden, I think it's still early, right? We're still 6 months out from the 5 months out from the election. So any grievances are going to be anti-incumbent, right? That is very public. There's a certain amount of nostalgia for the Trump administration and willful, whitewashing of some of his transgressions or lack of performance, his inability to respond to COVID, his rather moribund economic performance, honestly. But at the same time, I think there's more space for negative views of the incumbent. That's always the case. So right now, I think there's a general pessimism, but I worry that perhaps we're reading too much into polls that favor Trump and are opposed to a second Biden administration. I think when presented with the option, um, the difference is with 2016, I think people were reticent to support Trump publicly in 2016, and therefore we were surprised by his electoral performance and victory. Now we've come to 2024. I think people are happy to share that they're anti-Biden or pro-Trump, but I wonder if they're oversharing in a way, or the polls reflect uh, rather don't capture a sort of silent majority. I think there might be more of an incumbent bias than is being reflected in polls. Polls have never been super accurate. We know this, and yet we continually go back to them. So I'm just saying you've had conversations around the country. I would put more faith and more stock in conversations with Americans around the country in different places. I've touched a little bit on Rhode Island and the sort of variety of views here. Small state, blue state, and yet you still see Trump banners and FU Biden posters and hats and things like that. So it's complicated. I'm trying to remain optimistic that America comes to its senses in November.
I mean, of course, everyone's thinking about "Don't Look Up" movie, right? Which is like, you guys get it wrong. Everyone is gone, right? I mean, that's the unfortunate things. I think for me, the biggest, the takeaway for me was let's hope there will be other superpowers to save Earth, right? Just in case
Mm,
Americans gonna get it right. But I get your point in a sense that I've been hearing it since last December, January. This argument, especially by some democratic strategists, that a lot of signaling is going on here, signaling of dissatisfaction with Biden and
yeah.
hoping that Biden will make certain adjustments. Obviously, the first thing comes to your mind is the Gaza policy, but my understanding is also a whole range of other issues. Um, I want to also ask about this. I mean, again, none of us are representative samples, if we can put it in a statistical sense, but if you could get a kind of a intersectional understanding of the demographics by talking to people across different classes and socioeconomic backgrounds. One of the things I keep on hearing is, you read Financial Times, you see a lot of op-eds about how America is defying every logic about how politics affect economics. Because, on surface, American economy is doing fantastic. China is the one peaking, right? And yet, if you look at the surveys, if you talk to Gen Z, especially in younger folks from African American or Latino backgrounds, they have been really hurt by the cost of living problems in the United States. And I've been hearing this even from middle classes across the United States, especially in even, I'm sure, even more in the Midwest. And to what degree do you think that signaling argument is something to hold on to in terms of thinking that come the election day when people really realize that Trump could win, by that time I think there's a clarity on the court cases and all, then maybe they'll realize, okay, I may not like Biden, but I'll go for it.
Yeah, I mean the role of Latin American and African American voters is interesting. The African American vote is something that Democrats had always sort of counted on. In recent history, that is, the Republican and Democrat parties have somewhat flipped given the past history of racism in the South and Democrats' control of southern states until the 1960s or so, LBJ era. But it's a real toss-up, and it confounds me somewhat that ethnic minorities, near majorities of some of these groups are going for Trump or expressing supportive views of Trump now. I think, if anything, that highlights the Biden administration's failure to speak to those communities and the pervasive sense of inequality and social injustices that afflict our country, right? The Biden administration came to power in 2020 promising healing and a bridge across different political groups in the country and has failed to deliver to a number of communities. The foreign policy for the middle class has not really trickled down to encompass a broader message of renewal and growth and promise, because the pessimism that continues to surround our country doesn't really align with the economic figures that the Paul Krugmans and Tom Friedmans of the world will point to as indicators of where we should be or what we should be thinking and feeling. I saw an interesting article in the New York Times recently, to mention those two pundits, that said something like, the inflation numbers now and the unemployment figures now are actually, Biden has a better economic corpus to go on than Reagan did when Reagan was reelected in, was it 84, 88? I can't remember my history because, showing my age, I wasn't of voting age at that point.
Sorry, 88,
but
88. Yeah, 88, because 1990 will be W. Bush. Yeah. It's
right.
84, 88, and then it's 84. Sorry, it's 84. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I saw around 84.
84, it's 84,
And
yeah.
Reagan wasn't punished for his failure to stimulate economic growth as quickly as Biden has, and yet the national consensus is that Biden hasn't done enough for the economy here. So there's something that's going on with messaging that could be reflective of the way we receive news nowadays. If you look at how Americans receive news or whether or not they pay attention to news, a lot of that actually is indicative of your support or opposition to presidential candidates, right? So those who get their news on social media primarily tend to be more supportive of Trump. And those who get their news on TV, well, it's divided, of course. Fox News is its own little ecosystem, and CNN likewise, or MSNBC. These groups aren't speaking to each other, and therefore, depending on what channel of news you're watching or what source you're getting your news from, you might have a completely different read on the same basic statistics and information that are available to all of us.
This kind of silos information ecosystem that we're seeing, which wasn't there. So what you're saying, Hunter, here is that it's not necessarily a case of just Biden not being good at coming up with a convincing narrative. Because I keep on hearing from a lot of Democrats, the type of people who go on Ezra Klein shows saying like Biden just has to do a better job of selling his success or semi-success on the economic front. What you're saying is that there's a structural impediment here that even if I remember an essay by David Remnick at New Yorker after Obama stepped down, and Obama just said something along the lines, if only I had a chance to go and talk to these folks from the other side, like how I did it in Illinois. And the author said something along the lines, except that world is gone, right? the information pipelines don't work anymore. So in that sense, I'm actually even more pessimistic, because what is the room for Biden to improve the narrative of the salesmanship if there's a structural wall in that sense? Or you think there's just enough for him to eke it out?
Again, I remain somewhat optimistic. I think the Biden administration has realized its polling numbers are dragging, and it's not happy with that, and it's seeking to shake up its campaign strategies. Biden, he is an octogenarian. He's on TikTok. The campaign is doing things with social media that the Obama campaign couldn't do. So I think they're staying, up with the times, so to speak, and hopefully that message will get out. Because to me, the greater fear is that voters that are apathetic are going to remain away from the polls, and the presence of a third-party candidate, Robert F. Kennedy, we have certain spoilers like this that America goes unwillingly or unenthusiastically into a second Trump administration, I think is the greater fear. And therefore, there will be a lack of opposition and just general degree of cynicism that settles in. From 2016 to 2020, we had really active civil society, a number of protests, peaceful protests, pushing back on Trump policies. And American democracy remains strong. Our institutions kicked into overdrive. So my fear is that we don't have that same reaction if Trump is reelected based on a lack of a plurality, but lack of majority. And the Electoral College is another body that really skews our vote here and is really outdated.
Uh, I think that was a perfect segue, because the other question here is that could we have a kind of a Ralph Nader on steroid situation here, with Kennedy, among others, pulling off double digit, potentially 10, 12%, if not more of the votes, then creating a situation that no one gets significant electoral college. I mean, some people are talking, it might sound crazy, but you never know, because I think this whole, what you're saying, this kind of a wholesale dissatisfaction with the system, this is a fertile ground for third party people, and Kennedy happens to have the name, happens to have that kind of a populist branding and conspiratorial thinking that very much appeals to both ex-Trumpian people and even some Biden and Democratic people. How worried are you about that potential?
Yeah, my gut says that RFK is going to steal more Trump voters than Biden voters, despite the history of the Kennedy name with the Democrat Party. Um, but Trump's clearly concerned about RFK's role in the election, and I think has been quite vocal to denounce him. Biden hasn't quite done that in the same way. I think they've put together more of a strategy to sort of foreclose that possibility and to speak to voters that might be sympathetic to RFK, because I think they're somewhat agnostic when it comes to who RFK is going to steal votes from, but I think they're directing their messaging to make sure that, if anything, he's going to steal votes from Trump and not Biden.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, at the human level, I mean, you're young dad too, right? I mean, how do you feel about it? I mean, what are you gonna tell your kids maybe in a few years when they're in a position to have a more, I would say, sophisticated conversation than this? Um, like, how are you feeling? I mean, of course, we can talk about the Philippine short. And when Duterte was here, I would like, my goodness, like, what's going on? I don't know I don't recognize this country. Like, people cheering on extrajudicial killings and all of that. Of course, U.S. has a more robust democratic infrastructure, but you never know, right? I mean, in our European friends are openly warning that America could just tip over. I mean, how do you see that?
Yeah, certainly. Larry Diamond has said that the risk of democratic breakdown in America right now is more dangerous than ever. And partly we have this history of strong political divisions and mobilization of grassroots efforts to advocate, for individual liberties and their political perspectives. But the difference is now we have more guns in our society, more assault rifles and weapons that really have no use outside of war, present in this debate, and we've seen the willingness of various radical right groups, if I can use that expression, to intimidate voters and to intimidate the public to demonstrate their political views and to get their voice across in a debate where they feel like they don't have a voice. So that to me, and how close we came to a successful coup, January 6th, 2021, I think is stark and should not be forgotten because America likes to, say that it's this shining city on a hill, or Washington is, and we have lessons of democracy to share, and our democratic values matter a whole lot to our foreign policy and the way we see ourselves in the world. Um, but it could disappear quickly. And I think we should be very sensitive to that real possibility.
Hunter, now I think that's a good transition point. Let's get into the foreign policy front. Let's talk about scenarios. Under first, let's assume your, let's say, hope for scenario turns out Biden exit out, or who knows, maybe he does even well in electoral college terms. Mm, First of all, how important is it for Biden to win convincing enough this time? I mean, if the margins are too close, that could still bog him down domestically. Because now I want to talk about foreign policy. I mean, a Biden that wins another elections with even more question mark, or at least more polarization than we saw in 2020, how is that going to affect America's position in the world?
Yeah, I meant to revisit the statistics before joining our call this morning because I can't recall the exact margin in 2016. Um, my recollection is that Trump won more of the popular vote in 2020 than he had in 2016, even though he lost in the Electoral College. And the Electoral College could have gone either way. So if Biden had lost 50,000 votes in 2020 among a handful of swing states, the election could have gone to Trump, even though Biden had nearly 7 million more votes than Trump. So this institution really skews our representative democracy and continues to you know, to not reflect the popular will of American voters. And that has typically tended to empower Republican candidates. And I think Trump is banking on several large swing states that Biden is not polling well in to be his path to victory. And I think the Biden administration is increasingly nervous about this, and the campaign team is trying to address it. But if a handful of swing states go for Trump over Biden, and Biden wins by less than the 7 million or somewhat less convincing margin that is imaginable, it's quite popular that we could have any number of contested electoral scenarios at play. We've seen this playbook before. Trump was unsuccessful in saying the vote was rigged and we need a recount. Even Mike Pence carried this message. Kevin McCarthy, Speaker of the House, did the same on behalf of their preferred candidate. So in my mind, the Republican Party remains prepared to um, jettison the popular will for their own political survival. And that is the real threat to the potential peaceful transfer of power following the 2024 election.
Now, let's just control certain variables to say the transition happens by hook or crook. And let's say Biden is healthy enough. Obviously, the age element is something that I think is the elephant in the room at the very least. What do you think a Biden 2.0's approach to foreign policy would be, considering, and this is where I'm going to come in as a Southeast Asian, in particular Philippine and US allied country. One worry I keep on hearing is, even if we control all of those variables, it looks like the US is bogged down on multiple fronts. I don't see with the Ukraine situation, if Biden is in a position to finally tell Ukraine, hey, maybe you want to cut a deal here with Putin, right? Which somehow I don't think that's a legacy he wants to leave behind, right? And then of course the situation in the Middle East, I really have doubts that this is the end of it. I mean, it could go wrong in so many ways. And the China threat is just getting worse by the day. I mean, just in the South China Sea between Philippines and China, the potential for some sort of crazy escalation is always there, not to mention on Taiwan. So how do you think a Biden 2.0 administration would approach the Asia question against that backdrop, even if we were to say the domestic situation doesn't meet the threshold of total instability?
Yeah, it's a great question. Of course, the easy answer, the succinct answer is to say more of the same. I think the Biden administration has put in place a number of senior officials who have already expressed clearly their view that the Indo-Pacific is the priority theater, that China is the pacing threat. That continues from the Trump administration. The Biden administration inherited a great deal of continuity there on policy, but what I would like to see is more action and resources matching that rhetoric. So I would hope that a second Biden administration would continue to express or articulate a strategy forward facing in the Indo-Pacific that yet recognizes the threat China poses, that recognizes the importance and essential role of allies and partners in the region, including the Philippines, but puts more resources to match that. The Biden administration has extended a number of diplomatic trips to the region. It's sent Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo to countries in the Indo-Pacific. It's
Manila,
sent
yeah,
Boston on
definitely. She was
multiple
here. Yeah,
trips.
yeah.
Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan have all traveled to the region a number of times, and I hope it continues to do that. But in terms of recognizing the China threat, I don't think we've committed the necessary resources to a Pacific Deterrence Initiative that the Congress has pushed for and that the Biden administration seems to have recognized the need for, but has not followed through on that. But beyond sort of beefing up deterrence and spending more on defense, because we already spend more than any other country in the world on defense, and our budget is extremely bloated and needs to be right-sized in many ways towards the Pacific. Um, the administration needs to achieve something of a convincing or substantive economic policy because IPEF doesn't mean much to Indo-Pacific partners. And the only reason that they're signing on their support or signaling their support for it is really just to keep the U.S. engaged in the region, say, please give us something. So trade access is controversial, but a number of American polls suggest that the American public recognize the importance of free trade agreements. I think domestic political opposition in the highest levels is actually more of an obstacle than any popularity issues among the American public because I think some past examples indicate the ability of a second administration to bring about a policy reversal on free trade deals. The Obama administration did a successful policy reversal on the KORUS Korea-U.S. free trade agreement back in 2012. I can't remember exactly the year that was accomplished, but I would love to see the U.S. Signal its interest, or the Biden administration in particular, signaling its interest in renegotiating U.S. accession to and inclusion back in the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, because absent multilateral free trade agreements and positive economic statecraft for the region, the U.S. is seen as, an important security partner and, influential stakeholder, but really just missing in action on the
Yeah, kind of
most
an
important
incomplete leader.
consequential.
Yeah, kind of an incomplete power. Now, I want to push you on this a little
Exactly.
bit because the reason I ask about what would the Biden 2.0, what could it mean rather, is because I remember with Obama, for instance, uh, in one of the biographies about the Obama administration foreign policy, the idea was like in the first time we have to make sure we just do enough so we secure a re-election, and then we're going to do big things. And of course, the Iranian nuclear issue was one of the things that he was able to finalize in his second term. So he was very cautious on this issue in his first term for understandable domestic politics reason, but he made it a legacy issue eventually and got it across the line. So my sense is, are there similar things to that? I mean, in a sense that Biden felt there's just not the politics for it in his first term, or it's just too risky. But in second term, it's legacy. Who cares? This is about my life legacy. I am going to get through this as a matter of conviction politics. Do you see some conviction politics things that he could pull off big time with implication for Asia?
Hmm. Well, I don't see any sign that he's going to change policies. The foreign policy for the middle class that Jake Sullivan has articulated and the general preference for industrial state-led economic policies that we've seen across the Trump and Biden administrations, I think signals that essentially the neoliberal U.S. economic agenda is dead. And I think there's no going back at this point. That said, if the Biden administration wakes up to the fact that the most convincing way to compete with China is to compete economically, then perhaps as a path to sell CPTPP or some other bilateral free trade agreements, it's pursuing with the likes of Taiwan and other governments. I think it's updating its agreement with Singapore. This is the way to remain relevant in the region and not be seen as a destabilizing force.
And obviously, you have to compete with China. regardless. Now let's go to the Trump part before we transition to from the Southeast Asian point of view and bring in the whole hedging and your scholarly focus, Hunter. Um, what could be the good, bad, and ugly? I mean, just for the sake of argument, the quote unquote good that I hear is, for instance, there are people in Taiwan who felt that Trump is even more hardline on China compared to Biden. Although, of course, they turned out kind of wrong in terms of their panic mode. I think Biden has been quite reassuring to Taiwan, maybe beyond his own pay grade by saying, by implying there's a mutual defense treaty when there's not. But nevertheless, I think there's this affection for Trump in Taiwan. I saw that very strongly when I was there in 2019 as a Taiwan fellow. In Philippines, there are many who are strongly pro-Trump. As we speak, there are a lot of people there attacking Hunter Biden and all of that, just to give you an idea. Vietnam, many people appreciated dealing with Trump.
Yeah.
Uh, and the idea was that, this is a guy who, there's no filter. You know what you're getting, you know what you're dealing with, which is obviously the complete opposite of what many of us understand of Trump, which is he's completely unpredictable. And the no filter version he give you is different from the no filter version he's going to give to Xi Jinping or Putin later on, right? But the thing is, one thing I also hear, even from European partners, is that in a way he might help. For instance, the argument of Macron, which is we cannot rely on America forever. Germany has this. I mean, I hear this a lot from Germans also, that we hate Trump, but he's saying the right thing, that Europe has to take care of its own security needs. It's underspending. I mean, the levels of military capabilities key European countries have is close to pathetic, right? I mean, a couple of mid-sized Middle Eastern countries have more missiles and naval assets than practically all of the major powers in Europe. I mean, it's insane situation. Could there be that kind of unintended good again here? I mean, kind of a bad vessel for a good message dynamic here? Do you think that he could open up new he could break new taboos? I mean, I think a lot of things that Biden did correctly on China was because the taboo was broken by Trump, right? Or do you think that the second term is just going to be too wacko for us to get any of that element, or the low hanging fruits are already consumed already, exhausted?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, I think we have to be careful about what we mean by wacko exactly, right? The first Trump administration was wacko and incompetent, and I think a second, and because of that imbalance, I think it was actually more status quo than many expected. A second Trump administration, I think, would be same wacko, but perhaps more competent. And we have a number of potential returnees to the Trump administration. You mentioned Bridge Colby, Robert O'Brien, these big names that are floated, Mike Pompeo, et cetera, a number of figures who might return to achieve a more competent and policy effective strategy that actually works with the Congress and realizes how American bureaucracy and the levers you need to pull work. So that said, I think we could see more success from the Trump administration trying to achieve the goals that it stated and was thwarted on before. Um, you know, so you mentioned the sort of positive scenario. I think it's certainly possible that the Trump administration sort of goes full unilateral America, is simultaneously very bellicose vis-a-vis China, and yet neglecting of allies, completely neglecting of multilateral trade agenda, and just sort of all military and bilateral and less multilateral and sort of working with allies and partners. And therefore, this perception could exacerbate the view that the United States is undependable. And therefore, I think we see Southeast Asian countries looking to other partners, including Australia, Japan, India, Korea. And therefore, you see some kind of or at least perhaps the underlying multilateral reality of Southeast Asia, which I think has always been inherently multipolar due to reasons of geography, diversity, a number of things. That reality could come about to the extent that the U.S. is just not as relevant in a way. It's powerful, it's loud, but it's kind of like what's the expression? A bowl in a tea shop. Just knocking things around and just sort of treat it delicately, but make sure it doesn't tread on you. So that's one scenario. But at the same time, I also think it's quite possible that the Trump administration would stumble into a war or expect allies to step in a way that furthers deterrence, but um, without counting the costs of sort of going it alone, and therefore the U.S. ends up in a war it doesn't want to be in. The Trump administration prides itself on the fact that it didn't start any new wars under its watch. That's a common refrain you hear among Republicans. But it
Yeah,
got very
that
close
it
to
was
doing
so
so.
tough that, Putin didn't dare to attack Ukraine, or China didn't dare to do anything on Philippines or whatever, right?
Right. Never mind that Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine was already simmering,
2014
and a number of
onwards.
wars in Africa, which we're not going to mention. But I think the possibility, it's a very real possibility that the Trump administration could trigger a nuclear war. The Iran conflict is one scenario. North Korea wants to remain relevant. Kim Jong-un is going to try to get the Trump administration's, um, I'm talking like the election's been decided, would try to get the Trump administration's attention by doing something crazy. So there are any number of scenarios where I think threats, rivals would be trying to challenge the United States and take advantage of this moment of policy incontinuity.
Or to drive a wedge between America and its key allies, right? I mean, definitely China has many,
Right.
levers to pull, if not allies, let's say partners, whether it's Singapore, whether it's Indonesia, and then let's say even countries like South Korea to a certain degree, especially if a
Mhm, mhm.
left-leaning government comes back. I think what we're seeing right now is probably just an aberration under the current administration in South Korea, and Philippines, well, not until 2028, right? Unless Duterte's take over for some reason. I mean, they're a heartbeat away from the presidency as we speak. So those could be also the scenarios. But again, for the sake of argument, I want to go back to this. It's not like multilateralism has been really working, has it? I mean, okay, I mean, I see the value of the optics, even the semantics. I mean, we understand the psychology in that, we understand the journalism headlines importance, but Biden hasn't really delivered much on the multilateral front,
Mm.
right? I mean, we just discussed about IPEF, and the joke in town is IPEF
Mhm.
is a very ASEAN approach, which is like
Yeah.
full of symbolism and framework, and really there's not much, lots of
Mm.
sizzle, not much of stake, right? Um, and many would argue that the approach in the Middle East is not necessarily very multilateral. You see the United States as being, essentially alone on many United Nations Security Council resolutions. So maybe we're exaggerating either the importance of multilateralism in its own terms, or by the administration commitment to that. I think what we see is explosion of minilateral, trilaterals, AUKUS, Squad, JAFOS, so maybe it's smoke and mirrors, the multilateralism aspect after all.
Yeah, sure. I don't really have any disagreement there, but the lattice work has really come into strength, and I think it's been quite effective, And in part, I think this is the administration hedging against the possibility that it loses the election and wanting to have some kind of architecture in place that will last through a disruptive
Trump proofing.
unilateral or
Trump proofing, I think, is a technical
yeah,
term.
Trump proofing, and this works for the region as well. It works on a number of levels, but first, it works because I think these institutions would weather the storm of a Trump administration. Perhaps, he could scrap AUKUS, but I think that's unlikely. I think it's good for American businesses and sort of defense industrial complex. To be cynical. But also, the region's preferences are for a more diversified. Multi-directional approach that doesn't rely exclusively on the United States. So I think, therefore, these institutions and minilaterals, and by the way, there's no definition about what constitutes a minilateral versus multilateral, right? ASEAN was never considered a minilateral, even with the original five members, although the Five Power Defense Agreement or Five Eyes are typically referred to as minilaterals. So, size matters, but perhaps the Squad or the Quad, these groupings, they sort of are on the fence of unilateral versus multilateral. But all of these institutions, I think, signal that, there's still a precedent for cooperation and shared collective responsibility, burden sharing that work in favor of the United States, whoever comes to power in January 2025.
Other point on this, thank you again for that input. The other point on this is some people would welcome a Trump administration in our region because of the kind of the idea that, okay, I don't know about Trump himself, but if the Elbridge Colbys of this world are going to be in position of power, even more power this time, it's going to be a China first strategy. So that's good. My sense is even other, prominent Republican candidates who eventually had to head out of the race, they also had a kind of a Pacific first approach, right? So
Mhm.
in a very selfish sense, I mean, I understand our European partners or even some Middle Eastern countries panicking over Trump administration's implications. But in Asia, some would say maybe Trump would be good in the sense of Pacific first approach. Again, not Trump himself, but the Trump administration. As you correctly pointed out, we may see quite competent people actually in charge of the levers of foreign policy.
Yeah, I think that's quite possible. You know, I've always felt that Trump doesn't really have any priorities or interests besides his own personal interests. I think whatever makes Trump look strong and is good for the American economy, I think Trump will generally go along with. So, in this sense, yeah, I think someone like Bridge Colby would have wide latitude to implement this China first strategy, although I don't think it would really be Trump's. The same thing with the free and open Indo-Pacific, right? People commonly you hear in the media like Trump was the first one to identify China as the chief threat. I don't think this was really like Trump sitting there and drawing on a whiteboard, what are your lists of top threats around the world?
It's the
This is something that
Pottingers. Yeah, it's the Pottingers and those kinds of people.
exactly your policy team, your strategists are going to put in place. Um, and that's probably similar with Biden to a degree, although Biden, same generation as Trump, and yet I think he's much more of a traditional transatlanticist and sees a strong NATO as essential to American security, continues to see Europe as sort of naturally friendly towards America and prioritize that relationship. And then, of course, is quicker to get bogged down in the Middle East. Um, and again, here we're getting into hypotheticals, right? It's impossible to imagine how a Trump administration would respond to the Israel-Gaza conflict in a different way, because I think the Trump administration was very pro-Israel,
And very strong
has
to
signaled
Netanyahu. I mean, very strong ties with
exactly
Netanyahu
right.
himself.
They're tied at the hip in a way that indicates to me that the policy response would not be much different, and if anything, could be less equivocating and have no red lines when it comes to Israel's use of violence against civilians and Palestinians. Um,
And therefore
so
raise the risk of a conflagration in the Middle East. So that's so much
it
so
could
that
have.
even if you have a Pacific first, China first strategy,
Mhm.
you're inevitably going to get dragged into conflict somewhere else.
That's right. And we saw this with the second Bush administration, right? Or George W. Bush administration, right? The team and, you had excellent people like Mike Green and the National Security Council who wanted to advocate a Asia first strategy and really focus on China. And then, of course, 9/11 happened and you get sucked into the Middle East. So this is not so much a partisan issue as the paradox of the Middle East. And this is something you've written about, right? Your book on Trump back in 2017, I think, was very astute to focus on not just Southeast Asia, but to really embed it in a sort of global view. And the Middle East is an important region for the U.S. and the rest of the world.
Now I think that's a perfect transition to let's talk about Southeast Asia and your research. First of all, Hunter, I never managed to ask you. I'm sure other people are more aware of this. Why did you get so interested in the hedging issue and as far as South, because this is just naturally you think the best framework to understand what on earth is happening here among Southeast Asian countries, and obviously where you and I are in the same team is strategic agency. This is what we both believe in. I mean, you're an American, I'm a Filipino, but I think both of us understand that it's very intellectually poor and policy-wise very counterproductive to just dismiss nations of 300 million population or 100 million population as a bunch of just grass upon which to trample upon by the superpowers. Can you tell me a little bit how you get into the hedging discussion? And please explain for the sake of our audience who may not be as wonky, what do you mean by hedging? I think they'll completely understand once you explain it. Like, oh, I know what you're talking about. But
Yeah,
for
yeah,
the
sure,
purpose of
sure.
clarification.
So I got interested in this topic because I worked with great mentors at the Brookings Institution. One of them was Joseph Liao, who's a scholar at National University of Singapore. And he and I co-authored a book chapter on Singapore's foreign policy, which emphasized small b balancing and talked about hedging to a limited degree, but was trying to push back on the notion that Southeast Asian states are going to either um, uh, pursue one of these two IR international relations paradigms of either bandwagoning with a stronger ally or a threatening power, or to balance against a threat. And in international relations literature, balance means not so much finding this balance in the middle as balance against, push back against, to deter a threat, to respond to it actively by either bolstering your domestic defense capacity or by securing strategic partnerships and military partners to enhance your own ability to stand up to a threat. So Southeast Asia has never really exhibited much gravitation towards either of those competing poles, and therefore hedging has been the status quo since the end of the Cold War, at least. And really, it mirrors a past era of non-alignment. The non-aligned movement carries a lot of weight, continues to be powerful across Southeast Asia today.
Because this was
A
the
number,
cradle. I mean, the Bandung Conference,
that's right,
1950, this is the cradle
1954.
of non-aligned movement.
Yes, exactly. And so that tradition remains alive. The active and independent foreign policy, which countries advocate, thinking of Indonesia there, remains sort of the preferred path for dealing with great power competition. And as Bilahari Kausikan has told me and others made this point repeatedly, Southeast Asia is no stranger to great power competition. It's dealt with this before. It's quite comfortable at practicing this deft diplomacy of equibalancing neutrality when it suits its purposes, signaling to outside powers it's willing to sort of align to a degree on certain issues, and it will remain independent to the extent it's able to do so to preserve autonomy and sovereignty. And some of this stems from Southeast Asians' own experiences with colonial occupation and imperial powers. Including Japan, the French, the Dutch, the English, all of these outside powers having occupied by force some of
And
these
the devastating
countries.
Vietnam Wars, the
That's right.
Indochina Wars. I mean, three editions of Indochina War.
Right. So I think that colonial legacy continues to influence foreign policies today. Now, hedging, the term comes from the sort of finance literature around hedging your bets, not placing all of your eggs in one basket, investing all of your assets in one particular stock, but to have a sort of cultivate a fallback option, as scholar Chung Chui Quick puts it. He's one of the foremost experts on hedging who I really look to on this topic. And hedging entails the pursuit of sort of mutually counteracting signals to great powers to say, signal ambiguity deliberately and preserve autonomy because you don't actually want to align with any one country, but you want to sort of diversify, cultivate a network of partners that preserve that give you more options.
Thank you for that, Hunter. I think everyone understands that. Now, the question here is, does it apply to a U.S. treaty ally, especially one that has a mutual defense treaty like the case of the Philippines? We can have a debate about Thailand.
Yeah.
Is it really a treaty alliance? We can have a very healthy discussion about the case of Thailand. I would personally argue the Philippines is the full-fledged treaty ally, in the sole one in Southeast Asia. So
Yes.
is there room for hedging for a country like the Philippines in theory and practice? And I'm saying this, of course, against the backdrop of the Duterte administration, where you openly had this whole discourse of independent foreign policy, which effectively meant two things. Our treaty alliance with the US should never prevent us from developing a healthy relationship with China and the rest. And if push comes to shove, we are even willing to, jump the ship, right? That was the position essentially of Duterte. And so in short, just having a treaty alliance should not be an impediment to having a healthy relationship with multiple powers, even when you have territorial disputes with the rival of your treaty ally. I mean, that's on paper that sounded crazy, but in a way, Duterte made it look pragmatically sensible to a lot of average Filipinos. I mean, I had not debates, but Socratic discussions with taxi drivers, with folks along the streets who would say, I heard Duterte saying that. That sounds very sensible to me. Why should we risk things for America? And I say, how can we be neutral? We are ourselves involved. Yeah, let's get US help with China, but let's not be part of US plan for the region. Yeah, like realistically, is hedging doable for a country like the Philippines? And what is the threshold? I mean, you obviously know where I stand on this issue, right? But I want to get your point of view on this issue.
Yeah, so my own thinking on the Philippines has evolved a lot over the last few years of research and conducting interviews with a number of officials in the Philippines and scholars as well, including yourself. By the way, your interview was very helpful for my own project, I should note. So the conclusion I come to in my own PhD is that actually the Philippines under Duterte came close to sort of mimicking hedging, but ultimately I would argue that hedging entails consistency and intentionality or purposiveness. And therefore, Duterte wasn't hedging exactly. What I would call it is something I borrow this term from a scholar, Randall Schweller, underbalancing. So it's rather a lack of balancing response, and I mentioned balancing before, which is pushing back against a threatening power.
So
It's
it's
the
lower
lack
than
of that
soft
response.
balancing. So it's lower than soft balancing in a
It's
sense.
yes, it's lower than soft
Yeah.
balancing. So
I,
it's
I
the
would call it,
inability.
yeah, I would call it performative hedging. Right? So I
Well,
think,
that's funny. You mentioned the term,
yeah.
performative hedging, exactly what I use to describe Singapore in my
Oh wow,
chapter on
interesting. Oh
this.
wow, that's completely coincidental. Yeah.
So we've talked about this varieties of hedging, right? You use the phrase 50 shades of hedging in one of these papers we wrote last year or the year before now. Um, and I think that's exactly right, right? Singapore pursues a sort of style of hedging that is distinct from that of Indonesia, Malaysia, or Vietnam. Vietnam pursues a style of hedging which I call multi-directional hedging because it's not simply hedging between Vietnam and China, right? And those two, it's a sort of a false equivalency to say you're hedging between these two superpowers. In Vietnam's case, China is going to be way more important than the United States for a number of reasons: geographic, cultural, historical, and political, and economic. And therefore, Vietnam actually hedges against China by pursuing a diversified multilateral security strategy, which includes the signing of free trade agreements with a number of external partners and strategic partnerships with the likes of Korea, India, Australia, Japan, a range of partners, so it has other options besides relying exclusively on China. But it's never going to sort of hedge between hedge between the United States and China in the way that perhaps Duterte tried to do. And again, to get back to Duterte, I think, there were indications of hedging, yes, and I think the experiment with sort of on again, off again termination of the visiting forces agreement with the United States to leverage the Philippines position. And, Teddy Locsin, the former foreign secretary, argues that actually it took someone like Duterte, a tough guy, to stand up to the United States to achieve certain gains in the bilateral relationship and get respect.
That's the narrative. Yeah, it's like,
That's
who
the
makes
narrative.
it Duterte, blah blah blah. I think that, but I want to get your point of view on that because my counter argument to that is the Philippines, by virtue of its geography and its positioning on the South China Sea issue, has been more important to the United States. There was a belated recognition. I recognize that, but my sense is in short, you didn't need a Duterte to get the U.S. to take us more seriously. Because I do
Mm.
agree, and I think we had a Greg also saying this on our airport, said the Philippines was taken for granted. I mean, Hunter, you know that. I mean, most of Americans, Philippines is an afterthought in Southeast Asia. And I
Yeah.
think you even have a complicated relationship with.
Southeast Asia is an afterthought to America.
Exactly. We are an afterthought of an
Sadly.
afterthought. We're afterthought squared, right? And I think there's also this kind of a weird relationship because we're a former colony, but you never recognize the colony status of it. So there's a kind of a, especially with the Filipino
Yes.
intellectuals and even sometimes officials, there's this kind of a, yeah, there's a kind of an understated, grievance also there, if I can put it nicely. So what do you think about that argument? Again, sorry, I already entered with my own argument,
Mm.
but I'm curious how you see it as an American scholar of Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I read Daniel Immerwahr's How to Hide an Empire a few years ago, and that book really resonated with me. And in particular, I remember the chapter about the war, the Battle of Manila, which is just a story that's not even Americans aren't aware of, right? And we think of sort of Douglas MacArthur and the sort of history of island hopping in the Pacific and World War II, but we don't realize how critical the Philippines has been as a former colony and or territory of the United States dating back to the 19th century. And the history, the bond there, the deep people to people bond, the cultural bond, the fact that you and I are conversing in colloquial American English here, Filipino English, whatever you would call it. We clearly have a system and culture that resonate with one another. But that aside, from a strategic perspective, we've always taken the Philippines for granted. In more recent history, Um, the decision by the Philippine Senate not to renew the basing agreement in the 90s really sort of, I think, caught America's attention, even though we were sort of distancing ourselves from Southeast Asia after the Cold War. Simultaneously, Singapore swooped in and gave us basing access to Changi Naval Base. So I think that then the point was sort of forgotten that the Philippines did matter, it was relevant strategically as a player in the region, and furthered U.S. strategic interests, especially now that China is such a clarion call for U.S. defense hawks. Um, but yes, so 2012, the Scarborough Shoal incident barely resonates in America these days, right? But all Filipinos can point to um, that example of U.S. failure to sort of back up its words with action and come to the Philippines' defense and stand up for Philippine sovereignty when it comes to occupation of the Philippines territories and waters in the South China Sea, or West Philippine Sea, as it's called now. And then 2014, the EDCA agreement was essentially put on ice, and I think America was willing to sort of play the long game and wait out Duterte. But the visiting forces agreement really, seized Washington's attention. Again, Washington was patient. I think it took consistent um, efforts and attention from U.S. officials, including Pompeo, who first gave the clear security guarantee to Manila that, yes, even disputes or conflict in the South China Sea between China and the Philippines would trigger the Mutual Defense Treaty. And then Lloyd Austin repeating that, so continuity across administrations from Trump to Biden, as well as the perception that without U.S. support for the swarming of Whitsun Reef, and that extends to more than just sort of a U.S. military response, but also maritime domain awareness support, technological capacities that Japan is doing a lot to help with as well. But the United States really plays a critical role in, and U.S. Coast Guard and Philippine Coast Guard working together to sort of expand Philippine capacity to monitor its own waters, that all of this really did necessitate a continued U.S. presence, or at least active role in the Philippines for its own defense. And this archipelagic defense strategy has really finally materialized based on the support of outside partners. So I don't think the Philippines is really capable of going it alone. And perhaps Duterte tried to pursue that to an extent, but the U.S. alliance and mutual defense treaty was always sort of an anchoring, stabilizing effect. I think that sort of
Right.
pulled Duterte policies in past administrations. Duterte is not the first to try hedging in the Philippines, right? I think every administration, in 6 years is a long term. You have a lot
Yeah.
of bandwidth to accomplish an independent foreign policy, but you see a sort of reversion to the mean across multiple administrations. And in my mind, actually hedging precludes a mutual defense treaty or a security alliance, which I think indicates that you have, as a country, chosen a clear alignment strategy that is different from hedging.
Right. No, I understand. We're way past the 1 hour point, which I think we have to have more conversation about Southeast Asia for the next episode when you're available. But for now, the question I want to ask is, to what degree has the mutual defense treaty become more mutual and more reliable over time? Because I think almost everyone agrees that there was a tremendous degree of, I would say, more ambiguity than strategy to the strategic ambiguity that started from essentially Kissinger all the way to Obama. Uh,
Mm.
to what degree do you think that the mutual defense treaty is relevant for the Philippines? Because the question nowadays is, oh, once again, we're being fools. I mean, this is a line from the pro-Beijing or pro-Duterte camp, right? Like, you're playing fools. America will never go to war for you. They don't care about us. We're just there, blah, blah, blah. Of course, that whole 9 yards of argument. What do you have to say based on your understanding of the facts on the ground and also the American people's psychology? I mean, because I look at Ukraine and say, actually, it's quite dumb for pro-China people to use the Ukraine example because Ukraine is not even a U.S. ally. It has no historical, cultural, bond, linguistic bond with America, and yet U.S. just gave them $60 billion recently, facing Russia, and China is even more important adversary. So logically, the Ukraine example tells you that America would be even more helpful to the Philippines should it come down to a war with China, either directly or on the Taiwan question. What is your take on this issue?
Um, yeah, it's a complicated question. So firstly, I think we have to look at the Mutual Defense Treaty. And Renato de Castro really presents a convincing argument that actually the Mutual Defense Treaty was never meant to be sort of the bedrock of the alliance, and actually the ultimate deterrent against external threats for the Philippines. Actually, the basing agreement, which preceded the Mutual Defense Treaty, was a
Interesting.
signal that the U.S. had skin in the game, and therefore, if you have troops like we do in Korea, that is the ultimate deterrent against an outside country attacking a country where there are foreign troops on the soil. So the basing agreement, which lapsed, was meant to be more significant in a way than the Mutual Defense Treaty. And actually, Article 5 of the U.S. Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty only specifies, as you know, that the two parties must consult with one another about the best course of action in the event of a conflict. So it doesn't actually have
And
any
there has to
terms.
be domestic congressional also input. I mean, that's the implication according to constitutional procedures, right? Processes.
Right.
So
So it doesn't have that sort of triggering effect
the
that
automaticity. Yeah, yeah.
exactly. So it's quite vague, and I think in some ways it was wise of Defense Secretary Lorenzana to institute on the Duterte administration's behalf a review process to go over the terms of the defense treaty and perhaps update it for the 21st century. I still think that it could use a little more meat on the bones to specify exactly what course of action the two parties would take. And my sense is that the EDCA agreement has entailed more discussions. The I'm forgetting the acronym now for the policy dialogue, security and defense policy dialogues that
The two
occur
plus two. Yeah.
annually
Oh
as
yeah,
part of the
the board review, the one for the
MDT.
Mutual Defense Treaty Review Board. Yeah, 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 I know what you're saying.
That's
Yeah.
that's the one. Yes, the Mutual Defense Treaty Review Board, or MDB, I think. Anyways, and there's an SEB acronym that attaches to that. I've forgotten the details exactly, but Um, my hope is that the updated EDCA, which actually goes further than I would have ever expected by placing a number of bases in Luzon and in the north of the country, which have seemingly a direct relevance to a Taiwan contingency, although Marcos Jr. has been very careful to specify that there are no automatic assumptions built in about a Philippine response to Taiwan. And this is not meant as forward basing to encourage a U.S. unilateral act in the event of a Taiwan invasion scenario. So we're treading very carefully here. But the U.S. clearly has more skin in the game, and therefore the mutual part of the Mutual Defense Treaty, I think, is quite real now. And the Philippines obviously takes on a great deal more risk by ceding territory to U.S. bases. And, there's a delicate constitutional debate there around that issue and Philippine sovereignty, which dates back to before the 90s, right? And this stems from that history of colonization. So I think it's important to treat the government in Manila with all the respect it deserves, even as we try to achieve
Very
aims
important. Yeah.
that support U.S. security interests and ultimately provide the U.S. with, or provide the Philippines with the defense guarantees that it is seeking and it's comfortable with taking on.
Thank you for that last point. Obviously, I want to, hopefully we can have another podcast episode where we can discuss key countries in the region. I hate to say key countries, but let's just say five main case studies that we can talk about, you and I, in more
Kirk Campbell
conversation.
would say swing states.
Swing state, yeah, whatever. Yeah. Going back to this, are there lessons for the Philippines from other Southeast Asian countries, or it's a case of the Philippines is such a sui generis, and the nature and the gravity of the threats from China is so unique, and its embeddedness in the American alliance is so exceptional that it's really apples and oranges? Or is there something that the Philippines can learn from some of its neighbors, and if ever, which neighbors? On the hedging
Yeah,
question, obviously, yeah.
it's such an interesting question. Are hedging states watching other hedging states and following one another's lead? You know,
Hedging mimesis, right?
of course, I think the Philippines is sui generis, and at the same time, it has certain conditions that are shared by other states. It has maritime territorial dispute with China, as does Malaysia, as does Vietnam. Arguably, Indonesia does as well. Yet geography matters. So Indonesia, I think, is sui generis in its own way. That said, Vietnam and the Philippines have taken complete opposite tracks on the South China Sea disputes. Vietnam has sought to really bind China to its shared regime interests by not rocking the boat too much. It has held the sort of card up its sleeve of potentially pursuing international arbitration like the Philippines, but Vietnam has watched the Philippines example very closely, and I think seen that it entails more costs than it's worth for Vietnam. Um,
Or you can
costs,
piggy bank on the Philippines arbitration case without paying any costs. I mean, essentially, they're being extremely opportunistic about it. But I mean, speaking of Vietnam, there's
right,
also the aspect of Vietnam is just next to China's Pearl River Delta. So we're talking about trillions of dollars of investments over the decades, right?
right,
China is the key for Vietnam attaining its status as a developed country by 2045 or 2050.
yep.
And importantly, there's a Communist Party ties there, which is completely
Mm,
incomparable to the case of the Philippines, right? So that's why I'm asking, is it even sensible for us to say there's something for the Philippines to learn from Vietnam or vice versa? And honestly, the more I study it, the more I'm having doubts about those kind of things. I mean, like
mm,
in a generic thematic way, yeah, build your own capabilities, blah, blah, blah. But the more
yep,
you go
yep.
granular, it's just almost incomparable.
Hmm. I think it is incomparable, but at the same time, I think Marcos is uh, walking and chewing gum, or whatever the expression is, in a way that's similar to Vietnam strategy. Vietnam, there's a saying I'm sure you're familiar with, and some of your listeners will know that every Vietnamese leader must be able to stand up to and get along with China simultaneously. And I think that's the strategy that Marcos Jr. has pursued for similar reasons, right? China is essential to the Philippines' continued economic prosperity and growth, uh, the growth of a middle class and infrastructure development, which is much needed across the country. Vietnam shares that need and perception of China, although I think threat perceptions in the two countries are quite different. So Vietnam, there's a raft of an array of views on China and the threat it poses or the challenge that China poses. Whereas in the Philippines, I think the consensus is quite clear that China is a paramount security threat rather than just a risk or a concern, something less
Good point.
direct.
Yeah, yeah.
So that, in my mind, that is what's prompted the Philippines' balancing response and move away from hedging or a more ambiguous policy towards China. Whereas in Vietnam, I still think you have a great deal of ambiguity, some of that stemming from the lack of consensus on what China means for Vietnam. Exactly.
And I understand you have an appointment very short. My God, 1 hour, 15 minutes is nothing to us academic. I mean, we're horrible people, right? Like, it's like
It's
nothing.
always fun
Like,
chatting with you,
yeah,
Richard.
it's like now I'm just warming up. I'm gonna get my coffee now. Like, I'm like, we're really horrible people, we academics.
I'm not the night owl you are, though.
Yeah,
So I'm just getting my day started here.
yeah. Now, last point. Because I want to set the tone for next episodes. Hopefully, once we 20 that, and I want to get Colin, our good friends from Singapore, also in to get his point of view. I think it'll be an interesting. What do you say about this whole Singapore envy thing? One of the most annoying I keep on hearing. Oh, but this is what Lee Sheng Lu said. But this is what Lee Kuan Yew said. And I call that new colonialism in the sense that we used to listen to the white and blonde people. Now we want to listen to the Singaporean. Like Singapore case is again completely incomparable to the Philippines. They don't have direct territorial disputes. They have a cultural bond and linguistic bond to China that we don't have. They have a
Hmm.
completely different economic interdependence with China that the Philippines doesn't have at all. I mean, one thing that people don't mention is that we're the least exposed to China economically than any of the
Hmm.
major ASEAN countries. I mean, I
Hmm.
call it pledge trap, right? Like, where is the big ticket Chinese investments?
Ledge trap. I like that. Yeah.
Right, right. There's BYD investments in Vietnam. There are really huge investments in Malaysia and other countries, not as big as BRI says. But just last one on this Singapore thing.
Hmm.
Is Singapore just annoyingly dominating the discourse on strategy among others? I mean, of course, I love you. Our scholar Joseph is a great friend from NTU, by the way. But to what degree is
Oh,
this
I said
Singapore
NUS.
case?
You're
Yeah,
absolutely right.
yeah, yeah. See, I remember. But to what degree is Singapore really instructive for the rest of the region? Or is Singapore also so sui generis in itself because it's just a city state? No offense.
Yeah, Singapore is sui generis. Singapore's military deterrent is real. So I think we should, and its economic heft is so significant that I think we have to take it as more than simply a city state, right? Size is not the easiest way to capture or attach descriptors to a state's capacity or agency in this case. Singapore from independence realized that the only way to survive in an international system is to be relevant and remain relevant, and that's entailed continual adaptation and evolution of Singapore and its ability to meet the demands of a modern interconnected economy. So Singapore has been extraordinarily successful economically due to reasons of geography and also just having competent leadership from its first generation. But at the same time, Singapore has attached itself to the United States a great deal more than is commonly recognized in the debate today. Um,
Partner that
Partly,
acts like an ally, I think some of our good friends
exactly.
put
But
it.
yeah, so this is why I call Singapore's hedging performative, because actually, if you look at the granular details here, Singapore is quite attached to the United States military in a way that precludes its pursuing equivalent security ties with the PLA. The Chinese, I think, are aware of this and are permissive of Singapore to an extent because Singapore is still willing to sort of sing a song and dance the dance to signal ambiguity, and it talks hedging a great deal more than it practices hedging in a way. Um, but also, Singapore attached itself to the U.S. neoliberal economic order early on, and benefited extraordinarily from the presence of thousands of U.S. businesses and entrepreneurs. It's a hub for U.S. FDI in the region, and
And
Chinese.
billions of defense deals. I mean, the level of defense deals Singapore is doing with you guys, not to mention they just get their huge submarines from Germany. No one talks
Hmm.
about that. I mean, when I say it's a city that I didn't mean it in a dismissive way in terms of their
Yeah.
capacity. I'm talking about the geographic scope, right? They happen
Hmm.
to be
Hmm.
really a small state, but huge capability. I mean, I have friends from Japanese self-defense forces who told me that they think the Singaporeans can go toe to toe with them in Japan. I mean, so
Hmm.
I never underestimated Singapore's military capabilities or economic health. I'm just saying it's one thing to have a rural area and like Philippines the Philippines shorelines are as big as Russia. Just to put it into context, right? Well, fifth
Hmm.
or sixth longest coastal lines on Earth. So I mean it in that sense. But thank you for emphasizing that. I know that you have another arrangement to go to, but my sense is um I mean, I used to call it asymmetric hedging, but you're right. It's kind of a redundant to say because hedging by nature is never symmetrical, right? It's not exactly in the middle of the two. It's not perfect equibalancing. But I understand when you say Singapore's is a performative case because they already chose America. If you look at the granular details, I would say,
Right.
I would say that's like what smart performativity. The Duterte one was the kind of a populist performativity. This kind of I'm an independent, strongman and Filipino nationalistic. So when I use the word performative, I mean it in a very pejorative terms in a populist context. While the Singaporean one is a very different one. It's a diplomatic, subterfuge, smart strategy kind of approach. So maybe there's also varieties of performativity as far as strategic hedging is concerned. Thank you so much, Hunter. I can see that you're already transitioning to your next appointment. It's our fault. We're talkative. It's
No,
just
it's
what
my
we do.
pleasure.
My pleasure too, and I hope we can continue this very much soon. And thank you for being also for setting the tone for next conversation. Hopefully, with Colin also from Singapore. I want to get also folks from Singapore
Great.
defend their case. Good luck and more power to you. And as we Filipinos say, mabuhay. God bless. Talk to you
Thank you,
soon,
my
Hunter.
friend. Great to see you and catch up. Thanks for your
Catch up
time.
soon. Very soon.
Okay.
God willing.
Bye-bye.
God willing.